The abuse of state power and the urgent demand for accountability stand at the center of this tragedy, revealing a deeper crisis in how authority is exercised and monitored in modern society. When federal agencies are granted extraordinary powers in the name of security, immigration enforcement, or public order, those powers must be matched with equally strong systems of oversight. Without transparency, independent investigations, and public scrutiny, authority easily transforms into unchecked force, and unchecked force erodes the very democratic principles it claims to protect. The killing of a healthcare professional during a public protest is not simply an isolated incident. It exposes structural weaknesses in how power is regulated and how responsibility is enforced after harm occurs. Accountability is not about targeting individuals for political reasons. It is about ensuring that institutions operate within the law and respect human rights. When official narratives are released too quickly, when evidence is delayed or selectively presented, and when investigations appear slow or closed to public view, trust collapses. Communities begin to see enforcement agencies not as protectors, but as distant forces operating above the rules that govern ordinary citizens. This breakdown of trust has long-term consequences, including reduced cooperation with authorities, heightened social tension, and growing skepticism toward democratic institutions. True accountability requires more than internal reviews. Independent oversight bodies, transparent release of verified information, body camera access, and judicial review are essential components of a system that claims fairness. When these mechanisms are weak or inconsistent, abuses multiply not because individuals are inherently malicious, but because systems allow harmful behavior to go unchallenged. History repeatedly shows that when power is insulated from consequences, it becomes more aggressive, more secretive, and less responsive to public concern. There is also an economic and political dimension to this issue. Law enforcement agencies often receive increased funding, advanced equipment, and expanded authority without proportional investment in training focused on de-escalation, community engagement, and civil rights protection. This imbalance creates an environment where force becomes the default response instead of dialogue, and where efficiency is valued more than ethical restraint. The result is a cycle in which aggressive tactics provoke public resistance, resistance is met with heavier enforcement, and accountability becomes harder to achieve. Public accountability must therefore be seen as a democratic obligation, not a political inconvenience. Citizens, journalists, legal experts, and civil rights organizations play a crucial role in demanding answers, documenting evidence, and pushing institutions toward reform. When society collectively insists on transparency, it sends a powerful message that authority exists to serve the people, not to dominate them. Without this pressure, the gap between power and justice widens, and the promise of equal protection under the law begins to fade into symbolism rather than reality, creating a dangerous environment where future abuses become not exceptions, but patterns that quietly reshape the boundaries of acceptable state behavior. The erosion of civil liberties and democratic rights represents one of the most serious consequences of unchecked authority, because it reshapes the relationship between citizens and the state in subtle but powerful ways. When people begin to fear expressing dissent, attending protests, or even recording public events, democracy itself starts to weaken. The right to assemble, speak freely, and question power is not a privilege granted by governments. It is a fundamental principle that allows societies to correct injustice and hold leaders accountable. When these rights are threatened by aggressive enforcement tactics or the use of force in public spaces, the message sent to ordinary people is clear. Participation in civic life carries personal risk. This environment of fear does not appear overnight. It develops gradually through repeated incidents where authority is exercised without restraint and where those affected receive little justice. Over time, communities internalize this pattern and begin to self censor. People choose silence over engagement, withdrawal over resistance, and isolation over solidarity. This silent retreat from public participation weakens democratic culture more effectively than any formal ban or legal restriction because it operates through intimidation rather than legislation. The erosion of civil liberties also disproportionately affects marginalized communities, activists, and workers who already face structural disadvantages. When protest movements are met with surveillance, intimidation, or physical force, it discourages collective organizing and limits the ability of citizens to challenge policies that directly impact their lives. This creates an uneven political landscape where powerful interests continue to operate freely, while ordinary people are pressured into compliance through fear of consequences. The result is not stability, but deepening inequality and growing resentment. Another critical aspect is the normalization of extraordinary measures. When aggressive enforcement becomes routine, society begins to accept it as standard practice. What once sparked outrage slowly becomes background noise. Media cycles move on, public attention fades, and institutions continue operating without meaningful reform. This normalization process is dangerous because it lowers the threshold for future violations. Each incident sets a new baseline for what is considered acceptable behavior by authorities. Democracy depends not only on laws, but on public confidence in those laws. When citizens witness repeated violations of civil rights without accountability, they begin to doubt whether legal protections truly apply to everyone. This skepticism weakens the social contract that binds communities together. Instead of seeing the state as a neutral guardian of rights, people start viewing it as a selective enforcer of power. Protecting civil liberties, therefore, requires constant vigilance. It demands that people remain informed, engaged, and willing to challenge abuses, even when doing so is uncomfortable or risky. It requires institutions to prioritize human rights over political convenience and public relations. Without this collective commitment, democratic freedoms slowly shrink, not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet erosion that leaves future generations with fewer rights, fewer protections, and fewer opportunities to shape the direction of their society. The human cost behind political enforcement is often hidden beneath statistics, official statements, and policy debates, yet it is the most powerful and painful dimension of these events. When enforcement actions result in the loss of life, the impact extends far beyond the individual involved. Families are shattered, communities are traumatized, and entire professions feel the weight of loss. In the case of a healthcare worker, this cost becomes even more profound because the person lost was dedicated to saving others. The contradiction between a life spent healing and a death caused by state force exposes the emotional and moral tension embedded in modern enforcement practices. Behind every headline is a network of people whose lives are permanently altered. Parents lose children, partners lose companions, co-workers lose mentors, and patients lose caregivers. These are not abstract consequences. They are daily realities that continue long after public attention fades. Grief becomes a private burden carried quietly by families who must navigate emotional trauma while also facing legal processes, media scrutiny, and unanswered questions. This suffering is rarely acknowledged in political discourse, where narratives often prioritize institutional defense over human compassion. Communities also absorb collective trauma. When people witness or hear about violent enforcement actions in their neighborhoods, fear and mistrust grow. Residents begin to question their safety, not only from crime, but from the very institutions meant to protect them. This psychological impact alters how communities interact with authorities, how neighbors support one another, and how young people perceive the future. The presence of fear reshapes social behavior, discouraging civic participation and weakening the bonds that hold communities together. Healthcare workers, teachers, social workers, and other public servants feel this loss deeply because it strikes at the heart of service oriented professions. When one of their own becomes a victim of political conflict or enforcement action, it sends a chilling message that dedication to public good does not guarantee protection. This reality contributes to burnout, emotional exhaustion, and declining morale in sectors already under immense pressure. The ripple effect can reduce the quality of public services and discourage future generations from entering these critical professions. There is also a broader moral cost to society. When violence becomes normalized in the enforcement of policy, it reshapes collective values. People begin to measure success in terms of control rather than care, efficiency rather than empathy. This shift erodes the ethical foundation of governance and replaces it with a logic that prioritizes power over humanity. Over time, such a system produces more harm, more resistance, and deeper divisions. Recognizing the human cost requires moving beyond political slogans and institutional defenses. It demands listening to affected families, acknowledging suffering without conditions, and placing human dignity at the center of public decision making. Without this recognition, policies continue to be designed in abstract terms, disconnected from real lives, real pain, and real consequences that unfold in homes, hospitals, and communities every single day. The militarization of domestic law enforcement represents a profound shift in how the state interacts with its own population, transforming public safety into a framework shaped by force, intimidation, and control rather than service and protection. Over the past decades, local and federal agencies have increasingly adopted military style equipment, tactics, and language, blurring the line between war zones and civilian neighborhoods. Armored vehicles, heavy tactical gear, and aggressive crowd control methods are no longer rare sights, and this visual presence alone alters the psychological atmosphere of public spaces, signaling dominance instead of cooperation. This transformation is not accidental. It is driven by policy decisions, funding priorities, and political narratives that frame social issues as security threats rather than human challenges. When protests, migration, poverty, or social unrest are treated as battles to be won instead of problems to be addressed, law enforcement becomes oriented toward confrontation. Officers are trained to view crowds as potential enemies, public gatherings as risk zones, and dissent as disorder. This mindset encourages rapid escalation rather than patient dialogue and turns routine interactions into high stakes encounters. The consequences of militarization are visible in how quickly situations spiral into violence. Heavy equipment and tactical formations create an atmosphere where force appears normal and justified. When officers are surrounded by tools designed for combat, the threshold for using them decreases. What might once have been resolved through negotiation or community mediation now risks becoming a physical confrontation. This shift increases the likelihood of injuries, deaths, and long term trauma for both civilians and officers. Militarization also damages the relationship between communities and law enforcement. Trust is built through familiarity, accountability, and mutual respect, but armored vehicles and riot gear send the opposite message. Residents begin to see police and federal agents not as neighbors or protectors, but as occupying forces. This perception deepens social divisions and reduces cooperation in areas such as crime reporting, emergency response, and public safety initiatives. When people fear the authorities, they avoid them, creating gaps in communication that ultimately harm everyone. There is a financial dimension as well. Billions of dollars are spent on weapons, surveillance technology, and tactical equipment, often at the expense of social services, mental health support, housing programs, and education. These investments reflect priorities that favor control over prevention. Instead of addressing the root causes of unrest, inequality, and insecurity, resources are directed toward managing their symptoms through force. This cycle perpetuates instability while presenting the illusion of strength and order. Challenging militarization requires rethinking the purpose of law enforcement itself. It means shifting from a warlike model to a community centered approach focused on de escalation, accountability, and human dignity. It requires political leaders to resist fear based narratives and invest in training that emphasizes communication and conflict resolution. Without such changes, the continued expansion of militarized tactics will further normalize violence in civilian life and push society farther away from the principles of democracy and mutual trust that are essential for long term stability. The call for reform and public engagement is not an optional response to crisis. It is a democratic necessity when institutions fail to protect the people they are meant to serve. Moments of tragedy often reveal weaknesses in systems that have been ignored for years. Reform begins with recognizing that existing policies, oversight mechanisms, and enforcement practices are not delivering justice equally. Without structural change, individual cases fade from public memory while the underlying problems remain untouched, waiting to repeat themselves in new forms and new places. Meaningful reform requires more than symbolic gestures or temporary outrage. It demands policy changes that strengthen transparency, limit the misuse of force, and establish clear standards of accountability. Independent review boards, stronger whistleblower protections, mandatory reporting of enforcement actions, and public access to verified information are essential steps toward rebuilding trust. When people see that wrongdoing leads to consequences, confidence in institutions can slowly be restored. Without these measures, promises of reform become empty statements that fail to alter real conditions on the ground. Public engagement plays a central role in sustaining reform efforts. Democracy does not function automatically, it depends on participation. When citizens remain active through voting, community organizing, peaceful protest, and civic dialogue, they create pressure that institutions cannot easily ignore. Grassroots movements, advocacy groups, and local organizations amplify voices that might otherwise be silenced. This collective action transforms individual concern into social power capable of influencing legislation and institutional behavior. Education is another critical component of engagement. When people understand their rights, the structure of governance, and the mechanisms available for accountability, they are better equipped to demand change. Informed citizens are harder to manipulate and less likely to accept misleading narratives that justify abuse of power. Public forums, independent journalism, and community discussions strengthen democratic culture by encouraging critical thinking and shared responsibility. Reform also requires political courage. Leaders must be willing to challenge entrenched interests, confront institutional resistance, and prioritize long term justice over short term popularity. This often means facing criticism, enduring political pressure, and resisting narratives that equate accountability with weakness. True leadership is measured not by the ability to maintain control, but by the willingness to create systems that protect human dignity and uphold the rule of law. Ultimately, reform and engagement are interconnected. Policy change without public involvement lacks legitimacy, while activism without structural reform risks exhaustion and disappointment. When both operate together, they create momentum capable of reshaping institutions and redefining public expectations. This process is slow and complex, but it is the only path toward building a society where authority is balanced by responsibility, power is limited by law, and justice is not a privilege for a few, but a shared right for all citizens across social, economic, and political boundaries.